In the early 1900s, there was a logging camp in America that did not appear on maps. They had no public roads, no nearby towns, no elected officials, no sheriff within easy reach. What they did have was a railroad, a narrow gauge logging line snaking through miles of timber, owned by the company, operated by the company, controlled entirely by the company. That railroad didn't just haul logs, it hauled staples like food, footwear, and apparel, mail, tools, doctors, and workers. The company was the Potlatch Lumber Company. By the late 19th century, logging companies in Washington, Oregon, Northern California, and parts of Appalachia were pushing into increasingly remote forests. Potlatch was a town in northern Ohio that did not begin as a town at all. Founded in 1906 by the Potlatch Lumber Company, the town existed for one reason: timber. The timber was valuable, but the land was unforgiving. Steep grades, dense undergrowth, seasonal flooding, no infrastructure. Building public roads into this area was expensive and slow. So the Potlatch Lumber Company built something else instead: a private railroad, a logging line running outward from the massive sawmill into the surrounding timberlands. An entire camp was constructed along these tracks, and the railroad was the only way in or out. Now, add another layer. Many logging companies did not pay their workers entirely in U.S. currency. Instead, they paid in company scrip. Potlatch was one such company. Scrip was a form of internal currency. Paper notes printed with company insignia, metal tokens engraved with denomination, stamped checks, ledger credit redeemable only at the company store. A worker could spend weeks felling trees in the Idaho forests, loading log cars, riding brakemen or dangerous grades, and at payday receive compensation that could not legally circulate beyond the company's own ecosystem. If you left the camp with scrip in your pocket, it was worthless. The scrip was indeed legal, controversial, but legal. And its defining feature was simple: it could only be spent within the company's commercial network. If you carried it into a nearby independent town, merchants often refused it. Potlatch Lumber Company paid wages in scrip, but like many industrial towns of the era, it also operated a company store system where ledger credit and internal accounting were common. The company store wasn't just a convenience, it was the supply chain. Flour, salt, pork, coffee, boots, lantern oil, blankets, tobacco, medical supplies, clothing for families, tools for work, household goods, all of it arrived by train. The same logging railroad that hauled out timber hauled in the goods that sustained the workers who cut it. In many railroad logging camps like Potlatch, there were no competing merchants, no independent grocers, no alternative prices. If the Potlatch store charged more than a nearby town would, There was no nearby town, and if a worker objected, he could try walking out, but he wouldn't get far. Potlatch was not a wilderness shanty. It was organized, orderly, but economically centralized and intentionally formed as a monopoly. This is where the system becomes quietly powerful. Think about Potlatch's corporate structure. The company owns the land. The company owns the railroad. The company owns the mill. The company owns the housing. The company owns the store. The company issues the currency. The company controls internal credit systems. And the company controls the schedule of the trains. Every economic function runs through one single entity. That's not just employment, that's containment. If a worker wanted to leave, several realities emerged at once. First, he would forfeit unpaid wages as pay tied to pay periods and settlement cycles. Second, any scrip he held became useless the moment he stepped beyond company property. Third, since housing was company owned, leaving meant immediate relocation. Fourth, without the railroad, leaving meant walking miles and miles through dense forests. And that's assuming the company allowed him to board the next outbound train. Because the railroad was private property, there was no legal obligation to transport anyone, no requirement to align train schedules with personal departure plans, no competing line offering alternatives. Leaving was possible, but improbable. On the other hand, staying meant stability, predictable wages, predictable supply, predictable shelter. The system doesn't threaten you, it reassures you, and reassurance is persuasive. Over time, the economic perimeter becomes mental as well as physical. Not a prison, a contained world. Another documented feature of the company's scrip systems was credit. Workers could buy goods on account, boots before payday, food during slow months, equipment replacements. The store kept the ledger. If a worker accumulated debt, that balance was deducted from future wages. Leaving while in debt complicated things. It meant disrupting credit, housing, and income simultaneously. Some logging companies required debts to be settled before final payment. Others deducted aggressively from final checks. In Potlatch's isolated logging camp, where the store was the only supplier, debt was easy to accumulate and hard to escape. The logging railroad ensured that alternatives remained distant. From Potlatch Lumber Company's perspective, this structure was rational and justified. Consider the company's point of view. Remote operations were expensive. Rail lines required capital. Equipment required maintenance. Settlements required supply continuity. Keeping economic circulation internal reduced risk. It stabilized operations. It protected investment in harsh terrain. Centralization wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. But efficiency consolidates power, and in isolated environments, consolidated power shapes daily life in subtle ways. When one entity controls employment, retail, housing, and transportation. It doesn't need walls. It doesn't need guards. It doesn't need barbed wire fences. The railroad made timber extraction possible, and it also made a self-contained economic ecosystem possible, an ecosystem where value circulated inward, money circulates inward, goods circulate inward, workers circulate inward. Leaving is possible. It just costs more than staying. And in this isolated Idaho forest, the cost is often enough.